Nobody knew that the Uber driver and his passenger had met before. 20 years ago, on a battlefield in Afghanistan, their lives had crossed in the most extraordinary way. What happened during that ride would remind them both that some connections transcend time, distance, and the boundaries between strangers. It was 11:47 p.m. on a cold Thursday night in Chicago when David Chen's phone buzzed with a new ride request. After driving for Uber for 3 years, David had developed a routine: pick up, polite small talk if the passenger wanted it, drop off, repeat. At 48 years old, driving nights helped him make ends meet while his wife worked days. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work. The pickup address was O'Hare International Airport. David pulled up to Terminal 3 and spotted his passenger, a middle-aged man with graying hair, carrying a worn duffel bag and looking tired from what was clearly a long journey. "Ahmad Hassan?" David asked as the man approached the car. "Yes, that's me. Thank you for coming so late." Ahmad's accent was unmistakable, Middle Eastern, but his English was perfect, formal in the way that suggested education and practice rather than native fluency. As he settled into the back seat, David noticed the careful way Ahmad positioned his bag, the alertness in his eyes despite obvious fatigue. "Where are we headed tonight?" David asked, pulling away from the curb. "Lincolnwood, please. 4847 North Kedzie Avenue." As they emerged onto the Kennedy Expressway, David glanced in the rearview mirror. There was something about his passenger that seemed familiar, though he couldn't place what it was. The way Ahmad carried himself, perhaps, or the quiet dignity in his posture. "Business trip?" David asked, making the kind of small talk that helped pass the time during long rides. "Family visit," Ahmad replied. "I haven't seen my brother in 2 years. He sponsored me to come to America." The word "sponsored" caught David's attention. It suggested Ahmad was a refugee or asylum seeker, someone who had needed help getting to the United States. David had met others like him during his years driving, people who had left everything behind for reasons they rarely shared with strangers. "That's nice," David said. "Big family gathering?" "Just my brother and his children. My wife and daughter couldn't make the trip." There was something in Ahmad's voice, a sadness, a weight that suggested those family members weren't simply unable to travel, but perhaps unable to ever travel again. David had learned to recognize that particular kind of grief in his passengers' voices. They drove in comfortable silence for several miles, the city lights streaming past the windows. Finally, Ahmad spoke again. "May I ask, have you always been a driver?" "No," David chuckled. "This is my retirement job, I guess you could say. I used to be in the Marines." In the rearview mirror, David saw Ahmad's posture change slightly, a subtle straightening that suggested recognition or interest. "Marines," Ahmad repeated. "When did you serve?" 23 years total. Deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, few other places. Retired as a gunnery sergeant in 2018. "Afghanistan," Ahmad said quietly. "What years?" "Several tours, but my longest was 2003 to 2004. Forward Operating Base Chapman, near the Pakistan border." David noticed Ahmad had gone very still in the back seat. When he glanced in the mirror, Ahmad was staring out the window with an expression David couldn't quite read. "Chapman," Ahmad said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know that base." Something in Ahmad's tone made David look more carefully in the mirror. "You know Chapman? Were you military?" "Not military, no. I worked with coalition forces as an interpreter." David felt something shift in his chest. He'd worked with many interpreters during his deployments, brave men and women who risked their lives to help American forces, often at enormous personal cost. Many of them had been targeted by the Taliban for their cooperation with coalition forces. "An interpreter," David said. "That's dangerous work, brave work." "Sometimes dangerous, yes." They were approaching Ahmad's exit now, but David found himself driving slower, reluctant to end this conversation. Something about this man seemed important, though he couldn't explain why. "What part of Afghanistan were you from?" David asked. "Originally from Kandahar province, but I worked mostly in the eastern provinces, Nangarhar, Kunar, sometimes Paktia." David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Those were exactly the provinces where he'd operated during his 2003-2004 deployment. The coincidence seemed too specific to be random. "Did you ever work operations around the Spingar Mountains?" David asked, naming a region where his unit had conducted numerous missions. In the mirror, Ahmad's eyes met David's for the first time during the entire ride. "Yes," Ahmad said softly, "many times." David pulled into a gas station parking lot, his heart beginning to race for reasons he couldn't fully explain. He turned around to face Ahmad directly. "This might sound crazy," David said, "but what did you look like 20 years ago? Were you taller, thinner?" Ahmad studied David's face carefully. "I was much thinner, yes. Black hair, no gray. I wore glasses then, wire-rimmed glasses." David felt the world tilt slightly. "What was your call sign? Did you have a call sign the Marines used for you?" "They called me Professor," Ahmad said, and David's breath caught. "Because I had been a university teacher before the war." "Professor," David whispered.
Because I had been a university teacher before the war.
"Professor," David whispered. "Oh my God, Professor." Ahmad leaned forward, studying David's face more intently. "You are familiar to me as well, but you are older now. Different." "March 15th, 2004, David said, his voice shaking. "Patrol near the Pakistan border. IED explosion. 3 Marines wounded, 1 trapped under the Humvee." Ahmad's eyes widened. "The young corporal," he breathed, "with the burn on his left arm from the explosion." David rolled up his left sleeve, revealing a long scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow. "You carried me," David said, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "The medevac couldn't land because of enemy fire. You and Sergeant Martinez carried me 2 miles to the landing zone." "David," Ahmad said, and hearing his name spoken in that familiar accent broke something open in David's chest. "David Chen. I remember now. You kept talking about your girlfriend, about how you were going to marry her when you got home." "Lisa," David said, laughing through his tears. "We've been married 19 years now. 2 kids. Ahmad was crying now too. "I told you that day. I told you to stay awake, to think about your future wife, your future children. You saved my life," David said. "You and Martinez carried me when I couldn't walk. If you hadn't gotten me to that medevac, you were so young," Ahmad said. "We all were so young." David got out of the car and opened Ahmad's door. Without hesitation, the 2 men embraced. No longer an Uber driver and his passenger, but 2 veterans of the same war, separated by nationality and circumstance, but connected by a moment of shared sacrifice 20 years earlier. "What happened to you after I was evacuated?" David asked. "I tried to find you when I got back to base, but they said you'd been transferred." Ahmad's expression darkened. "The Taliban learned that I had helped American forces. They killed my wife and daughter while I was on patrol with your unit. My brother had already escaped to America, and he helped me get refugee status." David felt his heart break for this man who had saved his life and lost everything in return. "Ahmad, I'm so sorry. I never knew." "It was not your fault," Ahmad said. "It was the war. We all paid prices for that war." They talked for another hour in that gas station parking lot. David learned that Ahmad had spent 15 years working menial jobs while trying to rebuild his life in America. He'd never remarried, never had more children. The family visit he'd mentioned was to his brother's family, the only family he had left. David told Ahmad about his life after the Marines, how he'd used his GI Bill to go to college, how he'd worked in logistics for a shipping company until budget cuts forced him into early retirement, how he'd started driving for Uber to help support his family. "I think about that day often," Ahmad said. "I wonder about the young Marines we helped. I hope they had good lives." "Because of you, I did have a good life," David said. My children exist because you carried me to that helicopter. My marriage, my career, everything I've built, it exists because you risked your life for a stranger. When David finally drove Ahmad to his brother's house, they exchanged phone numbers, but more than that, they'd recovered something both of them thought was lost forever. A connection to a part of their lives that had shaped everything that came after. Ahmad's brother, Mahmoud, came out to meet them. When Ahmad explained who David was and what had happened 20 years ago, Mahmoud insisted that David come inside. They stayed up until dawn, sharing stories, looking at old photographs, remembering friends who hadn't made it home. A week later, David appeared at Ahmad's brother's house with his wife Lisa and their 2 teenage children. "Kids," David said, "I want you to meet the man who saved your father's life, which means he's the reason you exist." Lisa broke down crying as she hugged Ahmad. "Thank you," she kept saying. "Thank you for bringing him home to me." David's children, who had grown up hearing stories about their father's military service but never quite understanding its reality, suddenly grasped the weight of what their father had experienced and what Ahmad had sacrificed. In the months that followed, the 2 families became close. David helped Ahmad find better work through his contacts in the logistics industry. Ahmad helped David's children with their homework and told them stories about Afghanistan that weren't about war, but about the beautiful country and rich culture that existed beyond the conflict. On the anniversary of the day they'd first met in Afghanistan, David and Ahmad returned to that same gas station where they'd recognized each other. They made it an annual tradition, a reminder that some connections are too powerful to be broken by time, distance, or even war. "You know," David said during one of these anniversary meetings, "I became an Uber driver because I needed the money, but maybe the real reason was so I could be driving that night when you needed a ride." Ahmad smiled. "In my country, we have a saying, 'God writes straight with crooked lines.' Perhaps our paths were always meant to cross again." David's last ride as an Uber driver was taking Ahmad to the airport for a trip back to visit his brother. But instead of being a goodbye, it was the beginning of a friendship that would last the rest of their lives. Sometimes the most extraordinary reunions happen in the most ordinary circumstances. Sometimes the person sitting behind you in a car is someone who changed your life decades ago. And sometimes a simple ride across the city becomes a journey back to the moment that made everything else possible.